Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. Today we're going to talk about what is chunky yarn. Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you learn to knit the easy way. Today we're talking more about yarn, and if you've been watching for a while, you know I've had what is DK yarn, what is 4-ply yarn. Well, today we're talking about what is chunky yarn. So I'm going to give you 5 points for how you can identify chunky yarn, and then I'm going to show you my favourite knits for chunky yarn. Okay, here we go then. First point is that chunky is also called bulky. It's also called craft and rug sometimes. If you want to get technical, it can also be called double knitting. That is a phrase from a long time ago, from the years of when double knitting yarn started. And we can also call it number 5 yarn. There is the numbers ranking when you come to thickness of yarn as well. So that's the first point. The second point is that you are very likely to be using 5.5mm needles to 6.5mm needles if you are knitting with chunky yarn. The range can grow a little bit as you get to the larger yarns, and sometimes something will be classified as chunky or bulky, but you will be using 7 or 8mm needles. That's very rare. It's more likely to be described as a fashion yarn if it gets that large, but sometimes it still will be called chunky yarn. So be aware, especially if you are substituting yarn, using one yarn instead of the recommended yarn for a pattern. Right then, the third point is the plies. So if you look at the grading system, it gets more complicated because chunky yarn supposedly has between 12 and 16 plies. Again, that is a grading system that we don't use really anymore because it's not that relevant. You can still get chunky yarn that has a single ply. You can get chunky yarn that has 4 or 6 plies. It's very unlikely that you're going to find a chunky yarn and you're going to dissect it and actually find 12 or 16 plies. It is just a grading system that was used many years ago when a manufactured yarn was going through factories for the first time, and it was an easy way to describe it. The next thing you need to know, the fourth point about chunky yarn, is that you are likely to find between 75 and 120 metres of yarn on a 100 gram ball. And did you note that extra point in there, that when we were talking about 4-ply and DK yarn, we were talking about 50 gram balls because there was that longer length of yarn. If you were to put chunky yarn regularly on a 50 gram ball of yarn, then you were going to get annoyed because you wouldn't be able to knit very far before you had to change the ball, tie it together or felt it together and then start going again. It would get frustrating. That is why it is sold on larger balls of yarn. And the fifth point is that it is great for adult beginners. I love suggesting to beginners of knitting that they use Aran or chunky weight yarns because it's a medium weight yarn. You can see what you're doing, you can see the stitches. The needles aren't getting too big so that they're uncomfortable, and nothing is too small so it takes you an age to knit something. You can, as an experienced, good speed knitter, I can knit a chunky hat for an adult within 2 to 3 hours. But it means that a beginner knitter will take maybe a week to knit a chunky hat. If they sit down regularly every day to knit a part of it, maybe they'll only take 4 or 5 days. But if you were to knit that as a beginner in 4-ply or DK weight yarn, it's going to take you a lot longer and you might get frustrated with it, especially if you make a mistake halfway through and you have to unravel it part of it. It will say, oh, I haven't got the motivation to keep going. When is this going to finish? So thinking about beginning to knit, Aran and chunky weight yarns are brilliant answers for where do I start. Great. Okay then, let's go and have a look at what I love knitting with chunky weight yarns. So over here I have a few things in my basket. There you are, all ready for you. Now, like I said, I love knitting hats. Now, the purpose of a chunky weight yarn in a hat is that it is so much warmer. I love knitting hats for all the family in chunky weight yarns. Maybe not for babies because then it's just overwhelming. It's far too thick for a baby. I would say you really want to start knitting chunky hats for the winter if it's really cold, for toddlers and anyone who's older than a toddler, because they are so warm. And that includes anything like this as well, a beret, because it's got a nice band, and that band will keep the forehead and the ears warm, and then the chunky weight just really gives you great insulation around the head. I said this is perfect for me with my curly hair. It just gives me a bit more space inside the hat. I love wearing berets in the winter with chunky weight yarn. The other thing I do love my fingerless mitts in DK yarn, but they are that much warmer if I knit them in chunky yarn. And this isn't for someone who is walking through minus 40 Celsius, because by then you want to cover your fingers up. But if it is that little bit cooler and you want that extra bit of warmth, then a chunky weight fingerless mitt is perfect. And this kind of really smooth chunky yarn just really shows off the cable that much better as well. So this is a beginner's pattern. Once you've learnt your beginner ideas of knitting and purling, you can actually do a very simple cable. It's not that far of a step beyond beginner knitting. So this is the kind of thing that I would definitely suggest to someone who's in their first year of knitting and they just want a bit of a challenge. Go for it. It is certainly doable. So yeah, I love winter knits in chunky yarns, very much so. One of my favourite knits from yesteryear was a really cosy wrap cardigan, and that was in chunky yarn, and I wore it all the way through the winter. Didn't last very long, maybe 2 or 3 years, because I was wearing it so much, but it was so cosy. And that chunky yarn just gives you that extra bit of weight, the extra thickness to the fabric once you've knitted it. Okay, great. Go and check out the Yarn 101 playlist. Like I said, we have what is DK yarn and we have what is 4-ply yarn, with lots of other cool tips about how you can sort your yarn out and recognise yarn as well. Great. Okay, do subscribe because I know you're here, you love your knitting, and I'm here every week, every Tuesday, to talk about knitting. Thank you so much for joining me today. I will see you again next week. Bye for now. Happy knitting.